It is our absolute pleasure to host Lisa here today for what promises to be not only an engaging, but a timely conversation. It is wonderful, wonderful to have you, Lisa, and we couldn't be more grateful. To get us going here without any more delays, I will pass the baton on to Brian Rainey, who is one of our YJI's incredible research assistants. Take it away, Brian.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Youth Justice Institute's Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name is Brian Rainey, and I am a graduate research assistant with the YJI. The goals of this webinar are to act as a source for cutting-edge research on juvenile justice issues, to provide this information in an engaging and thought-provoking format, and 3, to bring together scholars and practitioners from various fields to explore these issues. I have one housekeeping item in the calendar invitation email that was sent out yesterday. We included a link to a web page showing how to access all of the features used today. Please reference this resource if you're having issues with these features. We highly encourage you to submit your questions as they come up. There will be points throughout the presentation today that are designated for answering audience questions, and we will have an audience Q&A portion at the end. We ask that you put all of your questions for Lisa into the Q&A section, and comments can be submitted through the chat function. And now that that housekeeping item is out of the way, I think that we're ready to hear from an expert in community violence and healing. Lisa Good is the founding director of Urban Grief, a trauma-informed, healing-centered, community-based organization that offers grief, crisis, and trauma support and education on the effects of violence, and supports to affected individuals through outreach and victim advocacy. She is a recognized authority in grief and trauma recovery. She is a graduate of Skidmore College and the University of Albany and is pursuing a PhD from the University of Albany's School of Social Welfare. She's the former director of SNUG and has over 25 years of addiction and human service experience. She's an experienced speaker and trainer, facilitating trauma-informed workshops on topics like adverse childhood experiences. She currently leads a grassroots initiative, training, coaching Indigenous community leaders on trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and resilience. She remains active in the fight to eradicate violence, increase awareness about the traumatic impact of exposure to violence, and break down the walls of isolation and fear by connecting community members with each other as resources and mutual support. So, without further ado, Lisa Good.
Good afternoon, and I am very excited to be here. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I have some slides that I would like to share with you. Although I speak and talk a lot, I must admit that I am very nervous today. So, but I want to get right into sharing some of my work and just the heart of the work that I do. So with that being said, I am going to share my screen. Okay, so my name is Lisa Good and I'm the founder of Urban Grief, and Urban Grief is a community-based program where we work actively to try to address the trauma and the harm that is caused by community violence. And so I titled this presentation, No Safe Space, Creating Pathways to Connect and Heal, because one of the resounding questions in my heart always, especially over the last year, is the idea of how can we heal when we continue to be hurt, right? And so for me, thinking through the issue of community violence and addressing the mental health needs, addressing the victimization needs, addressing some of the other impacts that kind of emerge as a result of community violence, I kind of find myself asking over and over again, how is it that we can support children and families when they're constantly under assault from violence. And so, I want to share some information, but I also want to share with you, I'm hoping that from the information that I share with you, that you'll get a sense of what some of my heart and passion is around this. And the reason why it's important that you get that part of it is because I think that it will inspire you to be creative, and for service providers and community leaders and families to really start to think outside of the box, and recognize that the pathway to connection and healing is not as far away as we might think it is, especially when we are surrounded with so much trauma and so many events that are causing people great distress. And so I want to go through some of these slides and just talk a little bit about some of the concepts around race and the violence, the impact, and I put a definition in about structural violence because I want us to consider that as we look at the issue of violence and those pathways to connect and heal. So the price of violence, there's in the capital region and all across New York State, there's been unprecedented gun violence. We are dealing with COVID-19. We're living in the midst of a pandemic that has also disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities through sickness and death. We're also living in the midst of a highly racialized climate. So there are lots of incidents, reported and unreported, of racial violence. So there's the experience of racialized violence. And then, COVID-19, unprecedented gun violence, and racialized violence really overlap in Black and Brown communities, adding to the cumulative burden of trauma and toxic stress that people are experiencing both individually and collectively. And then there's the foundation of it, or the undergirding component, which is the structural aspects that really exacerbate the experiences, the lived experiences around trauma and loss. And so the question that, as we go through this presentation is, I want you to be able to consider ways we can foster vision, resilience, hope, and post-traumatic growth. And so even though I'm doing the talking, so to speak, I also want all of you to be doing some thinking in a real hard, tangible way about how do we foster vision, resilience, hope, and post-traumatic growth. And that may mean or require that you step out of your professional cap or headset, so to speak, and look within your own life to pull out thoughts, ideas, experiences that you can make transferable into service sectors, and ideas about how we can serve families and serve young people in ways that mitigate the harm that they are experiencing. So when I talk about urban grief, and I talk about the work of urban grief, is, it's centered around this, right? A few key goals, and here they are. And I wrote these goals have not changed, right? And every time I think I want to change them, I think that it's just so core to the essence of, the spirit behind the work and the why behind the work. So I thought it would be good for you to see what the goals are around the work of urban grief, which I am proud to say we are now a part of the Trinity Alliance family. of the capital region. And so I'm really happy about that. But here are the core goals, core programmatic goals: to increase awareness about the emotional and mental health impact that result from exposure to violence and death, to provide information on maintaining wellness and resiliency in the midst of crisis, to break down the walls of isolation and fear by connecting community members and caregivers with each other, has resources and mutual support. And here's some of the core work that the program does. And we recently received, under Trinity Alliance, we recently received OVS funding. That's New York State Office of Victim Services funding. So for a long time, some of these core pieces of the work I was doing alone and with volunteers. But now with OVS funding, we're able to have staff that really kind of help push this forward. But this is the core work of the program: the trauma response, community outreach, injured victim outreach, victim advocacy, home-based victim case management, homicide survivor support, individualized crisis response, crime victim compensation application assistance, trauma, grief, loss education, information, resources, referrals, and support groups and events. And so that's just gives you some of like the core, like what's happening on a day-to-day basis, within urban grief. These are some of the pieces that we are actively doing to one degree or another on a day-to-day basis. So what is it, when we think about community violence, community violence, in the literature, community violence is defined as violence that occurs between non-related persons in public spaces, right? In public spaces. So that can include fights, it can include assaults, it can include shootings, it can include stabbings, it can also include sexual violence, right? It's not something that we typically think about as occurring in a public space, but under the umbrella of the definition of community violence, it encompasses that. But also, when we talk about community violence and exposure to community violence, it also includes witnessing violence. And so many times when we think about exposure to community violence, we only think about the direct victimization. We only think about the direct victimization. And so in reality, when you look at community violence as a whole, and the fact that by nature of its definition, it involves public spaces, then it's implied that there are other people who are also in those public spaces. But when we think about it from a perspective of trauma or community violence exposure has a traumatic event or traumatic events, oftentimes we only focus on that direct victimization, the person that was injured, the family members of the homicide survivor. However, there are indirect victims of community violence, and the trauma that they experience and the impact of that exposure is just as significant as what people who are the primary victims of that violence experience. And so I just kind of want to make that distinction, because sometimes as service providers, when we're engaging people and when we are assessing, we're only thinking about what happened to that person. And we actually need to also consider that the exposure to community violence may not be that they were the injured party, literally, but that they experienced injury and trauma through indirect victimization, which would include witnessing, that means seeing, hearing, or hearing about the harm caused to someone that they are connected to. So when we think about community violence, it's not equally distributed across neighborhoods. It typically occurs in neighborhoods where there is high disadvantage, right? Lack of, opportunity, uh, poverty, educational resources. There it's not concentrated, it's not spread everywhere. It's in specific areas, and those areas have things in common, and neighborhood disadvantage is one of those things. And so it's not equally distributed across neighborhoods. Community violence is one of the leading causes of injury and disability for boys and men of color. It is one of the leading causes of death for boys and men of color in Black and Brown communities. And to my point that I just made, the experience of community violence leads to individual trauma, and we get that, right? That makes sense, right? We get that part of it, but it also leads to collective trauma, in as much as that everyone in the neighborhood is impacted by an act of violence in a public space. Every person, whether it's the store owner, whether it's the neighbor, we all are impacted by community violence. So here's some information about the impact of exposure, because we're talking about youth and families. Now that picture is a picture of me doing a trauma-informed story hour at a park on Second Street and on Second Street near Henry Johnson. And it was because there had been a lot of incidents of violence at that, over the course of that summer in that area. And so I did an ice cream social in the park, and I did this story hour, and then we painted on canvas around themes of healing and play and fun. But I picked this picture because of these points that I want to raise in this slide, which is that the impact of exposure includes academic performance, right? It impacts how children are able to perform in schools. It impacts how teens and adolescents are able to perform in school, right? But guess what? Here's something you guys had probably not considered. It also impacts the academic performance of college students. Okay. And I know that from getting emergency calls and coaching and supporting students because they have experienced past exposures to community violence, and now something recent is occurring that's creating a crisis that in turn is impacting their academic performance. It also impacts relationship building, the ability to build trusting relationships with other people. So it impacts their ability to build great relationships. It also impacts the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex of the brain is responsible for judgment. So it impacts the brain development, and we know that from the information around adverse childhood experiences. It also creates difficulty for young people to be able to separate threat versus safety, real threat versus perceived threat. And part of the reason is that when you have been exposed to community violence over and over and over again, your stress system at some point in time doesn't know the difference. It's just always on, it's always ready. So there becomes difficulty separating threat versus safety. And then there is this decreased self-confidence. And I don't think that we necessarily think about how violence exposure impacts a child's self-confidence and their identity development, but children, they need to be safe enough to where they can explore relationships and where they can safely engage in their environments. And if those environments are compromised and not safe because of violence, then they don't get those opportunities. And when they are in settings where there is no acknowledgement about the harm that violence could possibly be causing in their lives, they start to second guess and question, well, is there something wrong with me that I can't focus in school today? Is there something wrong with me that I can't have friends? Why am I so jumpy? Why am I always in trouble, for, fighting or acting out? Never, ever being given the language to understand that, no, the things that you are experiencing in your community are traumatic, and here is the impact of those exposures, and here's how we can help and support you. And so even for children, going back to this picture, even for children and young people, it's important that from the youngest to the oldest, that we give young people language, okay? And we give them opportunity to explore what is happening in their environment and affirm their normal reactions, and then create and build bridges around relationships and connections to where we can support and help them to self-regulate and to help them access other resources that can get them through those difficult times. So let's go to the next slide. So in terms of traumatic reaction severity, I've been talking about neighborhood violence, but of course proximity does matter. So proximity means that the closer the incident is to that person, in terms of spatial closeness or proximity, the more impactful it is, right? And so, yes, you can be impacted by an incident that happened on the other side of town, but that impact is a little bit different if it happened right outside your door. So one of the pictures I had at the beginning of the presentation was a picture of Ashawn Davis, who was recently killed in Troy. And you saw that people from all over the capital region went to Troy. They went to Old 6th Ave to show, their support. They had a vigil. They had a bike, a motorcycle ride, in his honor. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people went through that area. Why? Because collectively, as residents in the capital region, we were shaken by the sudden and tragic death of this 11-year-old child. All of us wept, okay? People everywhere wept around about the death of this child, particularly in our Black and Brown communities. We wept over the murder of this child. However, we all got to go back home. After the vigils were over, after the marches were over, after all those things were over, we were all able to go back home. But what about the residents that lived on that block? That live on that block, who heard it, who saw him die, right? Who saw his blood, who heard the sirens, who saw the EMS, who saw the flashing lights of the police, right? They have to live with those visceral memories and that experience. So although people were impacted, proximity definitely matters in a case like that, and many other cases that are similar to it. Then there's the relationship to the victim, moderate versus high. So of course, the relationship connection also determines the impact. But with that being said, I don't want you to minimize or dismiss the fact that you don't have to necessarily know someone super, super personally in order to be impacted by the harm that has been caused to them because of injury or homicide related to violence. Another aspect of reaction is the lack of mediating person. And so when there are no mediating people, so like, I know you guys probably have all heard that saying that it takes a village to raise a child, right? But if there's no one home in the village, except for one person, and that one person makes themselves available to provide support or a safe space or some sort of recognition, or some words of wisdom. If there is a mediating person that young people have access to, that they are able to identify and have access to, that helps to mitigate the harm that they've experienced from the exposure to community violence. And then here we are, the potential to reoccur. And so one of the things that we've been seeing across New York State, but particularly in the Capital Region, because that's where I am, that's where I serve, is in the Capital Region, is that just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, it did get worse. And so what we found happening was that there was a continual reoccurring of violent events. And so when we think about that, there is, we're not on the moderate side right now in terms of the traumatic impact for families in our impacted neighborhoods. We're not on the moderate side. We are on the high side, because this past year has shown us over and over and over again that we don't even have a script for the level of chronicity that we're experiencing around the shootings and the violence right now. Then the last one is the forced silence, and is that moderate to high? And so a lot of questions, people always have a lot of commentary around, people not speaking up about the violence and all of those kinds of things. And I would kind of present this notion to you for your consideration, which is that around forced silence, that if someone had a gun to your head and said, be quiet or I will kill you, how quiet would you be? How quiet would you be? Right? And so I think that I use that as an example to really highlight the disconnect between our expectations around what you think people who are having these lived experiences should do versus the real choice that is on the table around safety and threat. Okay. And so again, all of these factors kind of contribute to the severity, of the reactions that we may encounter. Let's see if this is. So let's just talk a little bit about communities of color and trauma. So many people picture trauma, because we've been describing community violence has traumatic, right? But let's talk about racism has traumatic just for a minute. Many people picture trauma as involving violence, abuse, or disaster, and they fail to realize that factors such as poverty, racial discrimination, and incarceration can be equally traumatic. And so many fail to accurately respond to the trauma experiences of communities of color. And so when we talk about community violence exposure, and when we talk about responding to community violence exposure, has practitioners, has service providers, and has systems of care, we have to factor in the communities that are most harmed, most impacted, and we cannot do that separate from race, because racism and discrimination is the determining factor that contributes to the very existence and marginalization of these communities, right? And so if we try to kind of take a Pollyannish approach to how we connect and create pathways for healing within these communities, and we try to tap dance around the issue of race, then we're kind of really not connecting and really creating an authentic pathway to healing. Now, you'll create a pathway to your service door, right? You'll create a pathway to your service door, but the pathway to your service door and the pathway to healing might look different. Ideally, right, after some of this information, you'll start to think about how you can build and add on to your pathway to your service door that will also make it more culturally and racially sensitive so that there is healing and not racialized re-traumatization for the people that are coming into your services and your systems of care. So what is racial trauma? Physical and psychological symptoms people of color experience after exposure to particularly stressful experiences of racism, a cumulative experience where every personal or vicarious encounter with racism contributes to chronic stress. So this past summer, we certainly saw this intersection. So we have community violence, but then we also have, police violence. And then we have this intersection of racial trauma, right? And so the people that we serve, the children and the families that we serve have all of these elements of trauma that they're dealing with. So on one hand, there is the distrust of law enforcement and the overuse of power by law enforcement in many communities of color, which are over policed. And we have the mass incarceration and all of those numbers that bear that out. We have the racial disparity numbers in juvenile detention that bear that out, right? But at the same time, violence is happening in my neighborhood, and who are we to call? The police come, and understanding that may not be experienced has less traumatic or bringing a sense of safety, right, in that moment. And so there's always that tension there. And so as service providers, as we move in and out of communities, we just got to know that tension exists, but not only know that, we got to be prepared and have thoughtful conversations about how do we move beyond that and deal with that. So racism is trauma. Here's some other thoughts for you to consider: negative, rejecting, or demeaning societal messages that undermine self-esteem. Internalized racism is where people accept the negative messages and reflect that negativity in their behavior. And it's linked to a whole host of health problems, right? And so when we think about who's most likely harmed by community violence, when we think about these overlapping experiences about who's disproportionately impacted by COVID, who and how racism impacts people of color and their experiences, has victims and survivors of violence at all sections, whether it's medical, whether it's educational, whether it's law enforcement or criminal justice, right? We start to get a fuller picture that when you are serving people, it's not just the trauma that they may present you with. It's all of these other layering factors of trauma. So many of you are familiar. Many of you are familiar with the ACEs triangle, but this triangle, the other triangle, factors in the historical trauma around racism. It also factors in the social conditions in the local context, which would include community violence, right? And it also looks at the allostatic load that people are already carrying. And so when we get up here to the top, we see that in addition to the other aspects of adverse childhood experiences, we see all of these other layers that contribute to early death for people of color. So here it is. Around community cohesion, today's traumas are creating cultural changes. We see that with COVID. We see that with the community violence. The more cohesion there is in a culture, the more healing there is from trauma. A cohesive atmosphere allows for the exchange of pain. A cohesive atmosphere also creates a culturally competent sense of cohesiveness. So if you need motivation about why the cultural changes that we are experiencing because of COVID, because of all of the, the social unrest due, to race and police brutality and all of these other challenges that we are facing as a nation, if you needed to have a why, this is some of the why, that if we can find ways to create cohesion within our neighborhoods and for our families and even within our systems of care, then we can also have opportunity and pathways for connection and healing. So just really quickly, in terms of traumatic impact, these are some things that I see all the time within the work that I do, is that part of the traumatic impact as a whole is this disruption in social supports, right? That people aren't able to connect in the ways that they normally connect. So, a poll is going to go up right now about connections. And we know that COVID has disrupted our social supports and our ability to be present with people in a way that, we are accustomed to being present. And so if that is true for most of you, okay, that there has been some disruption in your social support, one of the things that I want you to think about when we look at community violence and the trauma that comes with community violence is that, it takes effort, guys, to mount up the energy to even reach out and engage your social support. And so when we talk about disruption and we look at COVID, and COVID inhibits our ability to gather, to comfort, to support, to visit, do all of those things, to show up for people in the physical sense. But not only that, when we layer community violence over it, community violence is so traumatic. Yes, go ahead and launch poll. We're going to put this next poll up as well. But community violence is so overwhelming, and I can't even describe it, but you don't have the strength and the energy to connect with your social supports, even though you need those social supports. And so when we think about those disruptions, I just kind of want you to think about that. And let's see if I can just move this over a little bit. So sorry. So the other thing is this disruption or distrust in the neighborhoods, right? So community violence. So there's layers of distrust. There's distrust, sometimes among neighbors, social networks, but there's also the distrust of law enforcement. So this generalized distrust, that's also a part of I can't see my screen, Brian, in the middle here. But that's also a part of the challenge, the traumatic impact, is that this distrust, because you're not safe, so you don't know who to trust. And then the last one is there's a disconnection from resources and services, and that's in part due to COVID, as well as the stretching of existing resources because of COVID. There's not as much. So I don't have time to go into the structural violence, but I do at least want you to think about, can we close this? Let me see if I can close that out. Okay. Can you take down the poll now? Because it's literally right in the middle of my screen. I'm trying to move it.
What you can do is you can just X out of the poll.
Okay. Let's see here. Oh, okay. I had a bar blocking it. I'm sorry. Okay. So structural violence. This was a quote I found. The way things are and always have been. And, I don't have time to really go into that, but I at least want to put this notion out here, is that structural violence is really about these social arrangements that perpetuate the experiences around community violence. These arrangements are structural because they are embedded in the political and economic organization of our social world. They are violent because they cause injury to people. And the reason I bring up structural violence is because so much of the conversation around violence and community violence it's blaming and it's shaming in its nature. And we rarely have conversations around the structural aspects around poverty, around redlining, around food insecurity, around housing discrimination, around deeply embedded racist policies that really help to shape and form these neighborhoods to a large degree, because the resources, the access, the experiences that people have when they are engaged and involved with systems of services is so defined and influenced by implicit bias and discrimination. And so when we talk about violence and community violence, I encourage all of you to move from this place of just the micro level, which is those people over there, and start to use your voice to actually consider the role of structural violence has a major contributing factor to to responding, to creating that pathway of healing and safety in response to community violence. That in as much as that, when we talk about discrimination, there's this term in the literature called constrained residential choice. And basically what constrained residential choice is this concept that even if people have the means, and many people do, they have the means to move to a better neighborhood, because of discriminatory housing practices, they're not given that opportunity. And we hear stories like that all the time. I hear stories like that all the time from victims, from survivors who want to move out of their neighborhoods, but they are actively being discriminated against and not having the freedom, so to speak, to move anywhere they would like to within the capital region. So I hope that you all know what resilience is, but it's really, I call it in a nutshell, your bounce back game. Your bounce back game. What is the individual's ability to bounce back after facing trauma or adversity? So we look at resilience at the individual level, but there's also this larger community level of resilience. And so, what can we do to support and foster resilience? Of course, we can offer choices, because traumatic events involve loss and loss of control and or chaos. We can increase the level of support and encouragement. We can provide a safe place for conversation, identifying existing natural supports. Now, that safe place, like when we think about encouragement and support, these are the areas where we as program providers and practitioners have to start to think about outside of the box. COVID has forced us to think about how we provide services outside of the box. So when we think about level of support and encouragement, what we think people need and what they actually need may be completely different when it comes to violence exposure. What we think people need in terms of safe conversation and what they actually need can be very different depending on your service lane, so to speak. And so the question that I want to, you to consider is, as a practitioner, are you thinking about how you are cultivating safety for conversations that involve racialized trauma and these overlapping and oppressive experiences of community violence and their experiences relevant to COVID? Are you a safe person? Or is it so that when people come and talk to you, they kind of have to pick and choose their words because, if they say the wrong thing and they actually express how they feel that you'll somehow or another punish them because you're uncomfortable with the discussion around race, or you haven't given consideration to that, to the role of race in your position of privilege. So I think I want to wrap it up. So here's community resilience. And it's the community's capacity and faith to withstand major trauma and loss, overcome adversity, and to prevail with usually with increased resources, competence, and connectedness. And again, the current COVID and this uptick in unprecedented violence in the capital region, in New York State, and nationwide really challenges this notion of community resilience. It really does, because where are the resources? And are we committing resources to a group of people whom we blame, where there is implied blame that they have the sole responsibility for the problem and the trauma that results from the problem because they are an actor in that trauma, right? And so, this rate, the current climate really challenges this definition. So community resilience, safety, help people access individual and collective strengths and capacities to recover. So for me, I have hope. I see resilience every single day. People are figuring it out, but they need more from us. How do we support families and communities in finding ways to mobilize so that they can address the impact of community violence? And that's what you see in the work of SNUG. That's what you see in Urban Grief's work. That's what you see in, the organizing that's happening around some of the social issues that are unjust. You see that organizing, and people are participating in that, and that participation in those organizing efforts actually create community and help and support resiliency. So here's the challenge. This is a picture by Frank Willis Thomas, and this is a real picture from his cousin's funeral. His cousin was murdered, if I have the story correctly, over a $400 gold chain. And you see it's a play on the MasterCard. Picking the perfect casket for your son is priceless. So whether loss is occurring in Black and Brown communities through COVID, through police violence, or community violence, we are faced with a challenge about how do we intentionally create safety for the people who are experiencing persistent harm. How do we kind of plug up these gaps? So again, this is some of the work that we do that I focus on. It's always attention to basic needs. Attention to basic needs. This is from the psychological first aid stuff, but attention to basic needs. This is what we do over and over and over again. And then we educate on trauma and the treatment process. We help people understand that what they are experiencing is normal, and through attending to their basic needs, that has been some of the most trauma-informed work that I have done, which is the attention, like everything that is therapeutic does not have to be therapy. And that's one of the things that service providers have to get out of their head, is that it doesn't have to be therapy in order for it to be therapeutic and bring some level of stability, especially in the early phases. So SAMHSA's definition of trauma-informed approach is the 3 R's, right? Y'all are probably familiar with that, but I want to reimagine in this just for a minute, which is that, we have to realize that community violence is impacting a lot of people. And in realizing that, we have to account for that in how we assess and develop plans of intervention for the people that we serve. We have to recognize the harm, the traumatic harm, whether it's the complex trauma that has emerged from, long-term exposure to violence. But we have to recognize that it exists and not react, but actually then respond in ways that facilitate healing. So we can offer choices, we can increase that level, again, re-emphasizing the safe place for conversation and helping people to identify natural supports. So meaningful check-ins, connect around a common cause, listen and learn, communicate honest responses, look for opportunities to support collective problem solving, and use of incentives to encourage engagement. So yeah, sorry, I talked a long time.
Okay, all good stuff, all good stuff. Before we ask one of our Q&A questions, I just want to ask a question of the audience about how they're going to take care of themselves today. So we know that this topic is hard and that it can be upsetting. So what will you do this afternoon to take care of yourself? If you select other, please feel free to elaborate in the chat. And for those who are viewing via Facebook, feel free to put it in the comments on the on the video. Okay, so people are answering. Several people say they're going to go for a walk, run, or exercise, get the blood flowing, doing some mindfulness exercises, spending time with friends and family, reflections via journaling, listening to music, cooking a meal. But the majority of people seem to want to go out for a walk, run, or exercise. All better people than me. Okay, so I'm going to end that polling. And then we're going to get to one of our Q&A questions. So to move toward communities of healing, how do the inequities of access to technology during this time of COVID impact the ability of moving this work forward?
Can you repeat it one more time?
Yeah, so to move towards this healing that you're talking about, how do these inequalities in technology during COVID impact the ability to move this work forward?
I think it definitely has impacted the ability to move forward, in as much as that, a lot of people, a lot of us as service providers are relying on, virtual kinds of things to connect with people and provide services. And so I believe that it's our responsibility as service providers to, you know, check with the people that we're serving to see if they have access. We had a situation where they had a cell phone, but they didn't know how to use it in order to download and use the apps that would actually allow them to engage virtually. So I think it's being intentional. I think that we can't just rely on virtual mechanisms. I think that we have to pick up the phone and actually call people. Not everyone has unlimited text messaging on their phones. I think that we have to pick up the phone and call people. It may mean that I know a lot of educators have been doing this, is that, they do drive-bys, on their student homes. I know that, we've met people outside in parks. You have to go the extra mile, but also finding financial resources that would allow you to supply and meet some of those needs. One of the things that we did for one of our survivors, who was an adult learner, is we got them a computer. Everybody was concerned about kids as learners, but there are a lot of adults who are, engaged in adult learning, educational pursuits. And this particular parent did not have a computer. And so after we assured that they had internet access, we got them a computer so that they could continue that pursuit. So I think we have to be creative with that.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time, but Lisa, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the YJI and everyone in attendance today for presenting this timely and vital work on community violence, trauma, and healing. And I truly hope that everyone here has found it useful and as interesting as I did. Before we go, I do have a few announcements. So tomorrow we're having an audience reflections and discussion session where we are going to have a viewing of this webinar and then a group discussion about the topics that Lisa has presented here today. And yeah, it'll be great. And the registration is the same as the registration for this webinar. So the Zoom access information is also there. I will also be sending out an email today with that information. So the next session of our Lunch and Learn series will be on December 14th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. We will be hosting Dr. Tim McCuddy of the University of Memphis, and he'll be speaking about online peers and youth violence. So the link to register for that webinar will be put in the chat momentarily. And if you're interested in hearing some of Dr. McCuddy's other work, we also interviewed him for the first episode of our podcast series, Let's Talk About Youth Justice, which explores bullying and cyberbullying. And Alicia will also be putting the link for that in the chat. And shortly after we finish here, as Dr. Lopez mentioned, we will be sending a survey to you all via email. If you have the time, please complete the survey, since it allows us to really get your feedback so we can improve the Lunch and Learn series. The survey should take no longer than 5 minutes. And finally, if you've not already done so, feel free to connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. The links to those accounts can be found on our website. And just a reminder that the views expressed here are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views of the New York State Youth Justice Institute. And in closing, I just want to thank you all for taking part in this session of the YJI Lunch and Learn series. We hope that you've gained something meaningful from this webinar and that you continue to think about the work that Lisa has presented. We also look forward to seeing you at future YJI events and webinars, and hopefully we see you tomorrow. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.